Hey guys, and welcome back to our final chapter for Unit 5, which is Chapter 14, Rural Land Use Patterns. So these three chapters are going to all be on your agriculture test. So again, that's Chapter 12, Chapter 13, and Chapter 14. So the essential question for this chapter is how do farmers and others who live in rural areas decide how to use land? So again, by the end of this unit, you will understand that the development of agriculture led to widespread alteration of the natural environment. The major agricultural regions reflect physical geography and economic forces. Settlement patterns and rural land use are reflected in the cultural landscape, and changes in food production and consumption present challenges and opportunities. Throughout time, there's been different types of settlements that have appeared around agriculture. One type is known as a clustered settlement. This is when people live close to each other. So that would be in like a hamlet or a village. And then they typically work the agricultural land surrounding that. Here in the US, this was common in the New England colonies where people came together, they set up their colony and they lived close to each other, and then they worked the agricultural land around it. A dispersed pattern is when farmers live spread out throughout the countryside. This was more common in the southern colonies. So in places like Georgia and South Carolina, this was the type of pattern that was established here. And we can still see this play out in the way that people live today. In the north, there's a lot more cities. People live a lot closer together. In the south, there's a lot less cities. People live further apart. And it's because of this original type of settlement pattern. Different countries have also used different methods for divvying up land and then dividing it amongst the population. In England, they used what is known as the metes and bounds system. And this was really used in terms of the natural landscape. So they used the natural landscape where the rivers and the hills and all of that type of stuff was to actually divide up the land. So metes were used for short distances and bounds covered larger areas. But this created irregular shaped property lines throughout. Here in the US, particularly west of the Mississippi River, we used what is known as the township and range system. This created a much more geometric grid pattern of how to divvy up the land. Instead of using what was on the land itself, we just divided everything basically into squares. So that's what the township and range system is. And each township is 6 miles long and 6 miles wide. And each square mile is called a section. So again, this creates this grid pattern. And we can see this on the landscape. You can see it when you look at a map of the United States. The further west you go, you should notice that the shape of the actual states gets much more square. And that's because this is how we divided up the land. Same is going to be true in the counties out west. The counties are basically all just squares when you look at those western states, all the way down to individuals' property. In France and in French colonies, they use what is known as the long lot system. And basically, this is where farms were attached to a river, and then they're long and skinny. That's what a long lot system is. So they run perpendicular to the river, these long and skinny plots of land to give as many farmers access to the river as possible. One of the most important things that you need to know from Unit 5 is the von Thunen land use model. So Hendrik von Thunen lived in Germany in the early 1800s, and he basically observed that we were going to use land differently in terms of agriculture if you were closer or further away from a city. So the reason for that is because of the cost of land and also the cost of transporting goods. So he noticed that farms close to the market tend to have products that are expensive to transport. Farms further from the market have products that are cheaper to transport. Now also I want you to remember that von Thunen lived in the 1800s. This was before we had cars or trucks or anything like that to transport goods. And so that is really the main thing that plays a role in where he says things are going to be distributed. But even with modern transportation, we still see this type of land use be fairly common in different places. So here's the actual model. So the von Thunen model is a model that uses concentric rings, so circles around a city that tells you where different types of agriculture is going to take place. So according to the von Thunen model, the first ring outside of the city, so that means in the center of this is the central city and the suburbs. The first ring outside of the suburbs, so that first area of rural land outside of the suburbs, you would find market-oriented gardens and milk. So this is where you're going to produce your dairy and where you're going to produce things like tomatoes. Now, the reason why you would want dairy and tomatoes to be grown close to the city is because both of those things are very perishable. You need to get your milk to the market quickly because it goes bad. Same is true for tomatoes. They're also expensive to transport. Milk is heavy. Tomatoes are very fragile, and so you need to get them to the market. And also, they're expensive to transport for those reasons, so you don't want to have to transport them far. Now, according to the von Thunen model, the second ring outside of the city is going to be timber or wood. Now, if you had to say what has changed the most about the von Thunen model, it really would be this one. In the 1800s, you needed wood to be close to the city because they used wood for everything in the 1800s. It was the main building material, it was the main heating material, so you needed wood to be close. Wood's also very heavy and so expensive to transport. Now today, we don't need wood to be as close to the city as we used to because we have all sorts of other materials that we use in terms of gas heating and steel for making buildings and things like that. So that has changed quite a bit. The third ring outside of the city is going to be for various crops. So this is going to be like corn and wheat and those types of things. Corn and wheat can be grown further away from the city because of the fact that it's not very perishable. It doesn't go bad quickly like milk does. Also, it's easy and cheap to transport. You don't have to be careful with a bag of wheat like you do with tomatoes. You can just throw it onto a truck and it'll be perfectly fine. Then the last ring is land for grazing. So this would be like cattle ranching. And it can be far away from the city because first off, it's extensive. So you need a lot of land. So you want that land to be cheap. And the further you get from the city, the cheaper the land is going to get. Second off, it's not very expensive to transport because animals can walk themselves. And so that is the main reason why we see this the further away. Also, things to note, other factors like a river can also change where things are located. So you see here on the right-hand side that if you have a river that flows through a city, then instead of it going in concentric zones around the city, we're going to kind of see it go out from the river itself because you can use that river for very fast transportation. So you can produce milk further away if you have a river because you're able to get it to the city very quickly. In the case of the von Thunen model, a bid-rent curve can be used to indicate the starting position for each land use relative to the market. We're going to talk more about the bid-rent curve when we get to cities, but basically it has to do with how expensive land cost is. The closer you are to the city, the more expensive land cost is. So in terms of agriculture, you're going to want to do your more intensive types of agriculture closer to the city and your more extensive types further from the city because it takes a whole lot of land for those extensive types of agriculture like livestock ranching. You want that land to be as cheap as possible, which you're going to get the further you are from the city. There really has not been anything that has altered the natural environment more than agriculture in terms of land use. And so there's a lot of side effects to our modern food production, including farmers have replaced forests with fields. So we've seen a lot of clear cutting of forests. And in fact, the number one reason for cutting down the rainforest is for agriculture, for cattle ranching and things like that. Farmers have also grazed animals in areas that are too arid to support crop production. And this overgrazing of these semi-arid lands actually creates more deserts. So this is especially severe in places like the Sahel, between the Sahara Desert and the Congo rainforest. Farmers have used irrigation to make some arid areas productive for crops, but this also has big environmental issues like salinization of the soil, meaning that we start to see areas become way too salty. Farmers have also drained lands too wet for agricultural practices. So we've taken wetlands, which are very important natural ecosystems, and completely destroyed them to create more agricultural land. Farmers have also terraced hilly or mountainous areas in order to produce flat areas for crop agriculture. We've also seen a lot of agricultural innovations, especially since the Green Revolution in the 1960s. One of the big parts of the Green Revolution we've already talked about are GMOs. So a lot of people have a negative connotation of GMOs, but in fact, we've really been genetically modifying our plants and animals since the first agricultural revolution. Today we do it in a much more kind of scientific and specific way, but just because it's a GMO does not necessarily mean it's bad. Now, the reason why GMOs many times get bad raps is because many of the crops that we've genetically modified, we've purposely modified so that we can do things to them, like spray them with pesticides and herbicides. Really, it's not the crop itself, it's not the GMO that's bad, it's the fact that if you're eating that GMO corn or whatever, it's probably been sprayed with a whole bunch of chemicals. So that's actually kind of the negative side effect of it. We also see the rise of organic agriculture, and organic agriculture means basically less use of GMOs and those chemical pesticides and fertilizers. One misnomer that a lot of people think is that if it's grown organically, it's not using any chemicals, and that's not correct. It just means it's using a certain type of chemical that's been shown to be less harmful. Aquaculture has also grown tremendously in the last few decades. And aquaculture is that growing of our food through water means. Now, that could be things like oysters, but it's also a lot of fish. So we see a lot of fish that are now grown instead of wild caught, which is good and bad. There's good because it means hopefully that we are not depleting those wild reserves in the oceans and lakes and rivers. It's bad because we also see a lot of issues when it comes to what is being fed to these fish and also diseases that are becoming more rampant as we have so many in a small area. This is known as the Blue Revolution, this huge growth in aquaculture that we have seen. So there's a lot of environmental issues that have been related to agriculture. This huge increase in chemicals and also the dependence on fossil fuels that we have for modern agriculture has a big impact on climate change. And in fact, it is industrial agriculture that is the #1 polluter and producer of CO2 in the world. We also see a huge depletion of water supplies as we need more and more for irrigation. We've seen a loss of biodiversity because of the increase in monoculture, which is the growing of just one crop in an area. We've also seen soil degradation because of overuse and erosion because of this, and also the huge amount of animal waste and what to do with it. So we've seen changes in food production and consumption. We've seen a big push towards what is known as the fair trade movement. And the fair trade movement is designed to get more money into the hands of small farmers in poor countries who actually raise the crops rather than supporting large transnational corporations that manage the trade in these products. I mentioned this in chapter 13's notes as well. So I think I used coffee as the example there, but fair trade coffee is going to be more expensive because of the fact that we're making sure that that supply chain, those people are actually being paid a fair wage. The location of food production facilities has also changed. Used to, most of our food production facilities were in rural areas and small towns. However, we've seen that shift now to be done closer to urban areas, and they're much, much larger. So instead of having these small food processing factories, we have much larger ones closer to the cities to take advantage of economies of scale. And finally, the last part of this unit has to do with gender roles in the food system. What is true is that really kind of throughout history, women have played a huge role in the food system, both in production and preparation. Today, in terms of food production, women make up 40% of the world's agricultural labor force. In less developed countries, it's almost 70%, meaning the majority of the workers in subsistence agriculture are women. The people who are out there hand picking rice and working in subsistence farms are mainly women. Now, food preparation in developed countries has changed a lot. Used to, it was the woman's job mainly for all of the food preparation. But in developed countries, as we've seen women enter the workforce, we've seen a lot less time devoted to food preparation. And because of that, we've also seen a huge growth in different types of technology through convenience foods, because women don't have the time to prepare meals like they used to. So again, that ends us for agriculture. So your agriculture test will cover chapters 12, 13, and 14. So make sure you guys are prepared for that.